too much on the Charles.
Well, I've got about 3 pages of his history here. And that's it. I guess you tell me what you want. But if you want
Well,
parts of it read or...
No, we can get that from you.
All right.
We got both. We got the family histories and we've got the tapes.
Well, I hope we live long enough to get a book.
Now, is that going when it blinks like that?
It's all right.
Okay, let's go. We'll catch you.
Cut it off whenever you feel like.
You ready then? Lamar, we'd like you to state who you are and your birthday and who your parents are and where you was born. Things like that to start out with on the tape.
Well, I'm Lamar B. Sessions. I was born on the 16th of November, 1913, which makes me 77 years of age now. I was born in West Ogden, 598 West 24th Street. It used to be a nice neighborhood, but right now it's not the nicest in the world. But every morning I go by there at the temple, I always look at it as I go by. Anything else about that?
Who were your parents?
My parents were Ole Clark Sessions and Alice Irma Barber Sessions. If you'd like to know where they were born, would you like
Well, anything you can give us about their
their history?
early life that you can remember.
Oh, it'll take a long time to tell it all. But Dad was born in Woodruff on the 18th of February 1892. And he came here with his mother and let's see, there was 7 brothers and sisters. They came to Syracuse about the 10th of May of 1910, as near as I know, right, I can think of it right now without looking it up, but that's pretty close. They arrived here in Syracuse the day that Henry and Jim Rampton were born, if that means anything. And of course, grandmother was a midwife. She was a widow, left with these 8 children, and she earned her living by being a midwife, and she brought in something, or helped to bring in something like 1,000 or more babies. Now, Dad, of course, grew up to manhood here. He went to school down in the west part of Syracuse, near Willard Bambro's old place, and then later on I think they came up to the first school that was built where the school is now, but of course there's only about either 2 or 4 rooms at that time. And then when I went there was 6 rooms. And Dad and Mother more or less grew up together, and they were married on the 21st of 18th of December 1912. And Dad was quite mechanically inclined. After they were married, they lived in West Ogden. They lived in 3, maybe 4 places in West Ogden. And I don't know how I could describe them to you, but one place we lived was in Wilson Lane when I was just about, probably 4 or 5 years old. And we moved back up on the hill on 24th Street, just below where I was born. I could point the house out if I was to be asked. And then from there we moved to Hooper, and Dad run the Hooper tomato factory there for, it used to be the old Wasatch factory.
Where is that located?
You know, the Wasatch factory?
In Hooper.
On the west end of 24th Street, right at the end of it there. Instead of turning onto Pennsylvania Street, you went right on just a few hundred yards there, and the old factory's still there, the building is. Of course, it's not in operation or anything now. Some other company has it.
When did he start for the Kaysville factory?
He started for the Kaysville factory And we moved here, as near as I can pinpoint it, about the 28th of February of 1924. And I was in the 3rd grade in Syracuse at that time, and Elsie Hanson was my teacher. Anything else there that you think Eddie'd like to know about?
Was that home there at the time?
The
The
old
Barnes had,
Yes,
where your parents
yes,
moved in?
Yes, now that was a new factory. Bill Varney had run the factory before and it burned down. And we came just as the new factory was just about completed. I remember hauling sand and gravel with my Uncle Charles Barber to help fill out the warehouse there, and then they put cement over it when I was just a boy. I was probably about 10 years old at that time. And Dad run that factory for, well, at least 35 years, and I think he was with Barnes for something like 37 or 8 years altogether. And of course it was owned and operated by Barnes, but called the Kaysville Canning Factory at Syracuse.
At one time there was 2 factories, about 10 years before this time. One was the Kaysville Cannery and the other was the Davis County. Is that correct? And then they merged.
In Syracuse?
In Syracuse.
I didn't know about that. I remember the old canning factory down where near Jack Kerr's property down there. I remember seeing that, but it was just practically in shambles when I saw it. And part of that, well, that old warehouse came from the old resort that was down on the lake. I can tell you more about that, connect it up with my mother if you like.
Okay, we can come back to that though. Okay, Faye Child and Willie Wilcox, and was it Ed Bills, purchased the old cannery and the building, and part of Faye Child's, we found out part of Faye Child's barn is from the timber.
Now that's the old factory down in the
That's the old
bottom,
factory.
down near Joseph Cook's property.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, I remember seeing it. And my mother worked there when she was a girl.
Okay, there's a man by the name of Peter Barton that run the, can you remember anything about him?
No, I remember hearing the name, but I never knew him or had any acquaintance with him. So I don't know anything about that.
Okay, well, let's stay on his father's side just a little more, if that's okay. If you have any questions. I wanted to back up just a little bit to see if you heard the stories about your grandfather on your father's side. He died of typhoid or something,
No, he died of snow blindness.
snow blindness.
He died in Woodruff before they ever came to Syracuse. Of course, naturally, I never did see him. He died about 1890, maybe even a year or two before that. I'd have to look it up.
And their home burned.
Yes, in Woodruff. It burned down, and well, yes, the people there helped them build another home, and they didn't stay there too much longer after that. Grandmother went to Evanston and took schooling on nursing, obstetrics.
I've read in her history that this has been in the family. There've been several that have done this, of her mother and perhaps grandmother. Do you know anything about?
No, Aunt Patty Sessions, but see, that would be no direct relative of Grandmother Sessions. Grandma was a tollman.
Yeah.
But Aunt Patty Sessions brought many children into the world as she came across the plains and then after she got here. And she was the wife of David Sessions. No,
David.
David. She was the wife of David
And
Sessions.
the mother of Harry Green.
Well, your grandmother must have lived in Bountiful for a while.
Grandma Sessions?
Yeah.
As a girl she did, yes.
Well, I can remember one notation. A Chloe Baird, who lived in Syracuse, went to Bountiful and took nursing schooling from Esther Sessions, which must have been your grandmother. I don't know what year that was.
That was probably Esther Maybe Sessions. Because
That doesn't add up
You-
to the fact that it was Grandma.
your grandma was not a,
Because,
she was a Tolman when she was a
She married, and after she's married, then they went up into Chesterfield, Idaho, and up that country, and then back down to.
But it was midwifery that
Yes,
she was taking.
That's
When
right.
she came up and started, this Chloe Baird came up and started practicing it in Syracuse. Well,
Yeah,
that's in there.
but I don't think she ever went down there and taught that. That just don't make sense that would happen in her life.
You said 1910. There's a little friction, but I'm not sure if your uncle could remember too well. He claims to be down here by 1904.
Well, when I stop and think about it, Mother and Dad were married in 1912, so that doesn't make a right date there. It was earlier than that, and I'm sorry, I'd have to go look it up.
I think there's a piece in the paper about them building the home in about 1904 or 05.
Well, they said it was the day that Henry and Jim were born, so maybe they were born earlier than 1910 too. So I must be wrong there. But that happened, I know.
But that's what the property, the courthouse says that your mother purchased the property where the home is on in 1910.
You mean my grandmother?
Your grandmother, I'm sorry.
That might be very true. Yeah, that might be true. I know that Uncle Elmer built that home where Grandma lived. He purchased the lumber piece by piece from, I presume it was Uncle Dan Walker, and built that home. I don't know how long it took him, but I'm sure it took him some time.
You say Uncle Dan Walker, how do you fit into that?
Well, everybody called him Uncle Dan Walker.
Okay, I called your grandmother Aunt Esther,
That's right. Well, it was the same principle.
and she sort of is,
Well, yeah.
through grandmother Stoker,
Yeah,
being a half
that's
sister.
right. That's correct too.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
your dad done a little carpenter work too, didn't he? Or Did
No,
he?
I don't. Not to any particular amount. No, I don't think so.
Cyril was a carpenter,
Uncle Elmer was a carpenter.
and Cyril, according to Cyril.
Oh, really? Well, I didn't know about that. See, I didn't know my Uncle Cyril until I was probably along about 12, 13 years old. You see, he went to war, and he was in Cuba during World War I.
3
And
years.
he didn't
said.
return until sometime after the war, and I never did know him till he was grown and up.
And then he was
Then
down
he-
there in Centerville.
Yes, and then he married Aunt Nolan.
Yeah.
It says in this history that Grandma Esther moved to Syracuse on the 20th of May, 1904.
Well, then you
And she arrived at the home of
You
her
had it
sister
right.
Catherine Stoker in Syracuse.
Well,
in
that's-
1904 then.
According to Cyril, they only stayed a few weeks with Catherine Stoker, but he couldn't tell us where they
moved from there?
moved from there. He says into the new home, but they couldn't have built it quite that quick, I don't think.
No, I don't.
Would this be before Elmer went on his mission? Or
Did they
after?
build it? No, it was before. Oh, I'm sure of that.
See, Elmer was on a mission,
He was on a mission.
long
during-
one, wasn't it? For about 3 or 4 years?
Yes, he was in Africa for 4 years. I remember when he came home, but I don't remember him before that time. And he was there during World War I.
Here's a little bit more on that. if you want it. It says that after they lived with Catherine Stoker, they moved into a home owned by Jesse Barlow for the summer. And then the day before Christmas of 1904, the family moved into their newly erected home and have resided there since. And that would be the one over by the grocery store there.
Just below the church.
Jesse Barlow, probably that's the one that,
Well, that wouldn't be Jesse B. It'd be probably his father.
yeah, they owned 20 acres and lived in Syracuse, down where Grant Thurgood lives. She was a sister to Tom Thurgood's wife, I think, Mrs. Barlow. And that's probably the home where they could have lived.
Probably.
And when they built those apartments, they dug up basements, didn't they?
Yeah. And that's how they were there, is some way through T.J. Thurgood over there. Well, let's switch to your grandmother, your mother and grandmother. Let's go back as far as we can to your grandfather too, Charles Barber.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember about him?
Well, you want me to start right at the beginning part of it?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Well, the history's here, if you want more particulars on it. But Granddad was born the 30th of January, 1863, son of Benjamin Barber and Olive Crowhurst. And they migrated from England to Centerville, and they arrived in Centerville on the 10th of June, 1876, and he was 13 years of age. Now, of course, he was born and raised in England at the parish called Chiddingly in Sussex, England. Now, Lola and I went through Sussex once, but it's just like going through Davis County. We didn't know just exactly the spot or where he actually lived, anything like that. But I remember Uncle Carl saying that, quoting his granddad, that they came from Salt Lake. They were sent out to Centerville, and they rode the train out to Centerville, and they were just, more or less, he said, dumped off the train, and then from there they went up to Centerville, and they went to a bishop. Let's see if I can think of it. I see it here. Can't remember just, but it was somewhere right near Page's Lane where he was dumped off. And anyway, Granddad was a young Englishman. They obtained work, and they made a living one way and another. And Granddad was a dashing-looking young Englishman, and then he met Grandmother, and Grandmother was a very beautiful young lady, I'm sure, and she could cook and sew. And my grandmother Barber had one
What
great.
was her name?
Alice Evelyn Barber, Kent Barber.
Kent.
She was a Kent. And Grandmother had the ability, and it was a great thing, she could make anyone, even a king, I think, feel right to home. And in her own home or anywhere that she went, she could make people feel at ease. And she had that great ability. And she was a wonderful cook. Many times I've eaten at her table. When Granddad and Grandmother got married, would you like to have the date on that? Or
Oh, not
We should
necessarily.
get them.
You can get it?
dates and that.
Well, they were married in the Salt Lake Temple, and they lived in Salt Lake for a short time, well, a year or two. Uncle Elgin was born there, and then they moved to Kaysville. They, from the Davis High School, it was just maybe about a half a mile south and a little west, and out in the middle of that field. Mother showed me exactly where she was born there. My mother, Alice Irma Barber Sessions. And then after a year or so, they moved to Syracuse. And according to their history, they lived in a home a mile and a half west of the present site of the church house. And I can't quite figure what home it was, but it'd have to be there probably across from Lon Williams's home or Jim Williams's place there now. Somewhere there close.
We've got Charles Barber living right on the Dickie Adams
Right. But that was later.
fruit farm,
Yeah, that was
right
right
about the
behind
se-
Joe Simpson's place.
yeah,
Right.
in a
Log
stucca
house.
log
That's right.
house at one time when he was
Mhm.
working there as a director, I guess, of the salt works and the
Well,
the other.
I think he had something to do with the
the farm itself.
no. Dick Adams had, I think he had something to do with the pavilion that was there.
Well, he and
He owned it, didn't he?
Kiesler owned the resort, the pavilion, the fruit farm,
Yes.
and the salt works. All of that's sort of combined.
And then Dickie Adams bought the cannery too, a little later. He owned the cannery.
And
And your father, during that period of time, he keeps coming up in the news that we read. We maybe should have brought that out on the computer and give it to him. We got the date that he moved into Syracuse.
that my father did?
No, I keep saying father because
You mean
your grandfather,
your
Charles.
grandfather, Charles Barber? Well, I don't know. I could go through here and tell you the exact date. I
Well.
think it's here, pretty close.
Well, that's okay.
But anyway, they lived in this house behind where Joe Simpson lives now for some time. And as you say, grandmother put up fruits, mostly jams and jellies for this D.C. Adams, and he sent it back east to his friends, I suppose, as a present, or maybe made a business of it. I presume he did.
And this is before the cannering. He had sort of a
yes.
home.
Yeah.
Wonder where that was. Have you got any idea just where that was
The
located?
cannery?
No, where she was putting up these preserves and that.
Well, it'd have to be right there in that home behind Joe Simpson's. Because they didn't do that after they moved up on the hill. I'm sure they didn't. And then he left.
See, Dickie Adams owned that home where
Painters too.
Yeah.
Painters.
Now this Dickie Adams, now that's not the Adams. We don't want to get it confused with the one in
No,
Lincoln.
we-
This is D.C. Adams.
Daniel C., but they called him Dickie.
Well, in the history, they call him D.C. Adams. But they did live there for several years, and I guess they did pretty well with their fruits and so on. Mother tells about the trains that came down the short line there, and of course they could roll it down pretty easily, but they always had to have a team to pull the cars back with team and horses until they got steam.
What was the name of that? They had a Syracuse company that did some of that, didn't they? Horse.
Railroad. I thought that was the one that went across the salt.
Good.
That's there, that's Syracuse.
Yeah, could be.
Jack Kerr tells about they had to have two horses on each side of the station,
car.
or on the engine, or on the railroad
The car.
train, the mules.
Yeah.
And they'd ride on there until they got back, and then they'd unhitch them and pull them back on out with them.
Well, I'm sure you, brethren, have heard a lot about that, but I've heard Mother tell about it a lot. And of course, they had that Y down there where they could turn train around and go back up, and I suppose that was later on after they got steam. If I'm not mistaken, I think later they had steam trains that went down.
Yes.
Well, I think from the very beginning, the steam train at least took them to the, in 1887, they finished the railroad. In January in that same year, 4th of July, they opened up the resort, and there's over 5,000 people there from Ogden, Salt Lake, and all over.
I know they came from all over the country there.
Dedication of it.
Yes,
And what, 2 or 3 years later, they built the big dance pavilion. Then they had a Bowery and all of those grounds where they had a lot of picnicking, and Dickie Adams was responsible for all of this.
He was from Syracuse, New York, wasn't he? Because according to the history here, that's why Syracuse was named Syracuse. At that time, it was part of Clearfield.
Well, yeah, Clearfield has always been part of Syracuse.
Well, one way or the other, but
No, it
that's the way
was Galbraith who started the first salt works, and he's the one that gave Syracuse its name. We've never found D.C. Adams connected with Syracuse, New York. He is a bachelor from Salt Lake City.
He was from back east. But I didn't think Syracuse, New York has never been mentioned in our dealings.
There is a possibility, though. I don't think it was LDS.
well, no, he wasn't LDS. I don't think he was, but I'm almost sure somewhere in this history it tells that he was connected with Syracuse, New York, and that's why it was named after him. Later on, if you want, I'll go through this again and make sure, but
Well, we pretty well pinpointed
those things.
Galbraith owned the land before D.C. Adams.
Well, I didn't know.
And
that.
Adams came in and bought it from Galbraith. And Galbraith already had the salt works going and the name brand of Syracuse from Syracuse, New York, before D.C. Adams came in.
He actually processed salt into 3 and 5 pound.
Well, here it is right here. It says, my parents spent several years here on the farm which was then owned by D.C. Adams, a man who came from Syracuse, New York, a man that this town was named after. Now this history was written by Charles Barber about his father.
Well,
Maybe he's wrong.
there's a little mix up there, but we're within a couple of years when, here's one for you, Lamar. What was it named before Syracuse? Hoboken.
What?
Really?
Hoboken.
I never heard that one.
We hadn't
Got
either.
3 sources.
We got 3 sources that pretty well pinpoints it.
Well, thank heavens that there isn't too many people that know that then, as far as I'm
That's why it
concerned.
wasn't Galbraith named Syracuse, wasn't it? Hoboken.
It was South Hooker Ward.
The Big
Yeah,
Range, the Willows, they're saying they've been called
But after Syracuse was more or less designated, then Syracuse took in a part of West Layton and some of Clearfield, as I understood it.
just about all of Clearfield.
And Clearfield was called
Part of Hooper.
Syracuse Junction, where the railroad came off from.
Well, let's see, what else would you like to know about?
Does she have any other memories other than the train being down there? The jellies and jams she preserved, any other memories you have?
Yes,
You
one, and I think I mentioned this to you once. Mother remembers when the people over on the island were over there. And she said they would watch for their signal of fires if they needed help and the like. What was their name? Can you remember?
Frary.
Ferry or Frary?
Frary.
Ferry?
You know, we put a
Yes,
monument there last.
Yes, I know that, and I'm aware of it. But she mentions that part of it. And other than that, I don't know of anything that's of any significance.
The ice cream parlor.
Well, but this is later.
That's when they moved up on the hill, they have the,
Yeah, now you
tell
want
us a
me to
little
go
bit
ahead
about
and...
moving
Yeah.
up there and
Well,
what about that.
Yeah, from there, they moved up on the hill, whereas just not more than about 300 yards west of R.C. Willie's furniture store there on the north side. And they lived in a house across the street until they got this home built. And I don't know, I don't have a date as to when that was done without looking through this again.
There was either Pages or Spencers living across the street at that time.
At that time, there was trees that lived there across from grandmother and grandmother most of their lives after they had
They
built
moved,
the place.
they bought
Edward
and
Tree
purchased
lived.
this a little bit later, around the turn of the century, or a little later than that.
Well, then Grandpa and Grandma must have built that home right around just before the turn of the century then.
Pretty close. We've got it in the newspaper. Should have looked that up.
Well, I have the whole history here, but you don't want me to read it again, so you don't want me to read all that, I don't suppose.
Well, we can get a copy of it.
I can make you a copy of these things. But I know that they moved there, and of course, from then on, why, Granddad worked at various things. He was quite a salesman. He worked for Studebaker Company, and he sold the first Studebaker automobile out of Layton that was ever sold in Davis County. Now that's quite a feather in his cap, if you can put it that way. And before that time, he sold Studebaker wagons. And the thing that I can remember most about my granddad was maybe two things. Was his strawberries that he raised. Maybe three things. But he raised some of the finest strawberries that was ever raised in the state, as far as I can ever remember. And as a boy, I'd go down there, and when he'd get enough strawberries picked, the girls would come early in the morning and pick them all day, and then in the afternoon he'd go out with a little T-model Ford pickup. It was different than most pickups. I'll never forget it. He called it the Red Mariah. And I thought I was in heaven when I get a chance to go with Granddad and take these strawberries over to Brown Ice Cream Company. Brown was one of the greatest ice cream companies in the country at that time. I remember Mr. Brown coming out to see Grandma and Grandpa and look at the strawberries. I'll never forget that. But Granddad was a very, very punctual man. Everything was timed right. He'd get up early and he went to bed early and whatnot, and he did things very punctual like. He later on he raised rabbits, chinchilla rabbits, and I think there's quite a few people around that can still remember those. I can very well. He did pretty good with them for about 2 or 3 years, and then he was a night watchman also. He was a night watchman not only here in Syracuse when my father was managing that factory, but when we lived in Hooper, and I was just a boy of about 7 or 8 years old. He used to travel in his T-model Ford car down to Hooper, and he'd get there at 6 o'clock right on the dot, and then he'd be the night watchman there, and he'd have to go through the whole factory once every hour, on the hour, and punch they call him a time clock at that time. And I know I went around with him several times when I was a boy. There's one other little thing that might be interesting about my granddad. He dug the footings for the chapel or meeting house, the old one that burned down years ago in 1938, wasn't it? It's the year Lola and I were married. He dug the footings for it.
You're talking about the original chapel,
That was there on the corner where it is now.
1898,
Might be about right.
when it was dedicated. The ward was made a ward in 1895 with Bishop David E. Cook.
But that was, they had meeting down below that time.
Well, they had two Sunday schools there. One down by Willard Bambrose and one over on Christensen's where the old school, the North Davis High School will eventually be.
And two primaries, and one sacrament meeting, so
I suppose in your histories too, you've recorded somewhere about we used to have religion class in school. Do you remember that, or was that?
You know, there've been some.
Before your day.
briefly, if you help us there with it and tell us.
Well, when I was I remember in the 7th and 8th grade at least, and Art Anderson was our teacher. And I don't remember who the religion class teacher was. I can't for the life of me remember who it was, but we did have religion class. And
I think it's been mentioned maybe one or two.
maybe you have
names.
something on
Those
that.
ladies.
O.B. Anderson.
Bessie Gately, I think, went once.
O.B. Anderson, that's Art's younger brother, taught here, and I think he mentioned his son.
There was one other thing about Granddad Barber, and that's in this history if you like to take it, some of it. They were very interested in horses in those days, naturally, because that was their means of transportation and transporting their beets and their tomatoes and so forth. Granddad worked for a company that owned a stallion, and Granddad had this stallion, and one that they purchased from, I believe it was Kansas, back east anyway, and they paid over $4,000 for that horse.
Back then, that'd be a lot of money.
That was an awful lot of money. An awful lot of money. So he was, well, I don't know if he's known for it, but he did that too. Granddad did a lot of different things, not only farming. About 22, one or two, somewhere about then. Granddad and Uncle Elgin and Uncle Myron and Grandmother went up to Driggs, Idaho. And for 3 years they tried to run a big ranch up there. It was more or less a dry farm ranch right up against the west side of the Teton Mountains. But just about every year the doggone frost had killed their crops. They had to give that up.
I understand. I was had a friend that lived there. They only got one crop of alfalfa a year.
Yeah. I have a friend right down the street here. I've got to go home teaching to him tonight that's been working up there, right exactly about in the same place. He says that they had quite a time that way.
Now, your grandmother there, when they was in that home, sold ice cream, didn't she?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I remember your Uncle Lawrence Criddle telling you about this at my mother's funeral. And of course I've read lots of stories and histories about it too. But naturally everyone in those days was trying to keep their head above water and to make a little extra income some way or other. And Grandmother had the knack of making some of the best ice cream in the world. And Sunday afternoons, after sacrament meetings and churches was all over, a lot of the younger people especially would come to Grandmother's, and she had one big room on the southeast corner there, and she put a big table in there and served ice cream and cake. And they also sold a few candy bars. I don't know where they got them from to sell, but they did. And they'd give them a big heaping dish of ice cream and a piece of cake for 10 cents. And of course that was something in those days. They had no other place to go for recreation, especially in their afternoons on Sundays. And I just assumed that Uncle Elgin and Uncle Myron and maybe Uncle Carl, he was just a young man at that time, I'm sure, maybe very young. But they would turn the freezer for Grandma, and then they'd get it all ready and pack it good and nice for the next day for Sunday. They'd do it on Saturday. Of course, this would naturally be only during the summer months, I'm sure. But I remember Lawrence Criddle telling this story, and he says, oh, how good that ice cream was. And I'll never forget him saying that. Lawrence Criddle, to the day he died, oh, he loved ice cream. Every time I ever went up there. Every time I ever went up to their place, he'd say, well, come on, Lamar, let's go in and have some ice cream. And I've eaten ice cream at his house many times. Was there anything else now that you think of?
Well, your grandfather was your grandfather twice.
That's a good point, something to think of. There's not very many people that has a grandfather that married your grandmother in their later life, and they were no relation at all. My grandfather, Barber, married my grandmother, Sessions, in their later years. I can't tell exactly how old, but I'm sure Granddad would have been 65 or older, and Grandmother would have been at least that old. And they lived together about 3 years, and then Grandfather Barber died. He died about the 10th of October, 1933. I know it was 33. Sure of that. Grandmother died March the 10th, 1930. That was one of the saddest days of my life. Grandmother, as I said, was one of the greatest cooks that ever was, and I guess all ladies in those days were good cooks. They had to be, because there was just not much to cook. But Uncle Carl tells how Grandmother, and I'm sure this is true, how she could just take a little of nothing and make a good meal out of it some way. And I've eaten at her table many a time. She could do it. She could roast ducks, and I've never eaten duck that tasted good to me since she died. I can't think of anything else.
Could I touch on, not directly, but you mentioned that you thought your father was involved in putting a sewer line in front of Gene Tolman's garage going west. Can you tell us about when that was and how you remember that?
Well, I was going to high school at that time, so it'd have to be along about 1928, 29, 30, somewhere right close to there. And they put in, now T.J. Thurgood was more or less mayor. I don't know as he was designated mayor, but he was over it. But Dad did a lot of the work. And they had a man by the name of Fugel. I can't think of his first name. And his son came too later on and worked, putting that sewer system in. And they stayed at our home there in the old factory house. And Mother fed them. She had lots of boarders in her lifetime.
You remember where it started and how far away it went?
No, I don't.
Just the fact it was...
No, I wished I did. I do remember that it started somewhere there where the factory is and went south to the corner. And I remember Dad and Gene was trying to help him a little there too, but in front of his blacksmith shop there, they was having trouble about something, and I know that for quite a while there was dirt piled up there and they was having trouble. And I'm almost sure it went east from the church house, but how far I don't know. I just a young kid, I could have cared less about anything in those days, but I remember that.
Then the Kaysville Cannery, I think, purchased the ground where the later on Syracuse City bought it for their city dump.
Way down the pastures?
Uh-huh. where we had the city dump down there.
They dug a big trench down.
Well, no, they'd dig their trench and put the garbage in it and then backfill it
Yes.
for a few years. I think Kaysville Cannery bought the ground and started bringing their garbage down. And then the city bought it from Kaysville Cannery, and that's where the city dump remained until we went in with the Clearfield.
Yeah,
I
I
don't-
remember that.
I don't remember too much about that. That might have been the time when either I was going on a mission or after I was married. I don't know, but I remember going down there and seeing that big trench. And I didn't get down there more than once or twice, but I remember seeing it. My father owned some property down there
His
where
was
that
the
old
old
silo was.
Yeah, the old white elephant they call it, not the white.
No, it wasn't. That was the cook's place.
Well, the Cooks, but
No,
yeah.
this was further south.
Yeah, but it had a name. It had a name. I can't remember.
Well, Lawrence Carbage owned it at one time.
Lloyd Cook does now.
Yes, and I think my dad sold it to his father.
Jessica.
I think so. Dad didn't keep it too awfully long.
Well, your father never farmed, did he?
No. No, he owned two farms. One there where, oh goodness, well, Kay Harai run it for a long time. What's his name? His son's name, not George. But it's over in the southeast corner of Syracuse, and it used to be the Carbage place. But Dad bought 30 acres there, and it was good ground. My Uncle Charles Barber run it for about 5 or 6 years, and he just couldn't make it go. And it was running them both into debt. And finally, Dad had this little caterer, and the boy, he made it go. He was really a good farmer.
Is Dick Barber and
It was Dick Harai, that's who it was too.
Dick and Glenn, were they sons of Myron?
Yes,
I remember him.
yeah. Yeah, and then after a while, Dad bought that piece of ground from, I'm pretty sure it was Lawrence Carbage, down where the old silo used to be. You know where that is now, what I'm talking
Yeah.
about?
Down this before you turn to come up to Sandy Beezer's there.
Well, yeah, it was.
Around the corner.
Well, if you're going south
Down
from
Gentile.
Sandy's, and then up towards Gentile, is around that bend, and then in on the north. And there used to be a basement house there. In fact, Uncle Myron and Aurelia lived in it. I guess the last time anybody ever lived in it.
Aurelia, she was a walker.
She was Maud Bennett's sister.
Um,
And this Rhoda, what was it? Rhoda Bonham, her sister.
she's really alert, isn't she?
Sure is.
I haven't seen her for many years.
I've never met her, but she's so much like Aunt Maudie. Not necessarily in looks, just the mannerisms.
The dress. Very flowy, yes.
Anything else you can think of that you might like to know about?
We'd appreciate the written histories, if you don't mind.
Uh-oh.
Copy of
Now
those.
Don got him right in his office. He can take them down and bring them back tomorrow if you dared trust us.
Well, I trust you, but it'd be easier for us, I think, if I just took them out and run them up and had them copied, and then I'll give them to you. I'll get them to
To
you.
run them down home and copy them there.
Okay. It's your office down there?
Yeah,
Oh, all right, that'll be fine.
it won't cost you anything.
Oh, I'm not worried about that. No, I'm just glad to help out if I can.
Now, your father was, I think, done quite a little bit for the community, not only providing work for a great deal of people, but he was involved in the Lions, starting of the Lions Club. And tell us a little bit about your father in that vein, would you?
Well, Dad was involved in lots of things pertaining to Syracuse. He even played ball when we first came to Syracuse, not on a regular basis, but I remember him even playing ball to some extent. But As far as the Lions was concerned, he didn't join the Lions till several years after it had been organized. Of course, Jim Rentmaster was a man back in most of the beginning of that, as you know, your brother. And I always appreciate what he did. But later on, and I don't know who was president at the time. It could have been Phil Barber, or well, I believe it was when Phil Barber was president. But nevertheless, Dad joined the Lions just to help out, and he really did help out. He did an awfully lot towards getting a Bowery there and improving the grounds, the baseball grounds, and the stands and so forth and so on. And he had to work pretty closely with the school board. And Harold Holt was superintendent of the Davis County Schools at that time, and he went to Harold and he got a lot of concessions from him and the school board in order to get the grounds there improved. And Dad did an awfully lot of work. He was there first and he left last. And he was very interested in getting it done. And he did do a lot towards that part of it too. Oh, there's one other thing Dad helped a lot on. Maybe most people would never know it or even think about it, but when the present Stake Center there in Syracuse was built, Dad was the finance chairman, and he overseen the financing of that thing.
Back then, the wards had to pay most of the share,
You
didn't
bet
they?
they did.
Not like it is now.
Yeah, and he
Came up with a lot
told
of money.
me a few things about the troubles, if you can call it that, collecting monies and whatnot, and trying to get men to go and collect the money itself. And I got one of the biggest surprises in my life. You may not ever use this, but he told me that of all the people, one of my best friends, Jay Bodley, but Jay and I have fished together for 35 years or more, and he said Jay was the best collector of any of them. Now why, I don't know, but Jay, if he made up his mind to do something, he'd do it, and he'd get it done. But I'll never forget him telling about that part of it. See if there's anything else I can think about that Dad had something to do with. And I'm sure there was lots of more things. I guess you brethren know that he was superintendent of the Sunday school in Syracuse for several years, and he started the Perfect Sunday program.
Perfect attendance.
And we have a picture here of, it's here somewhere, we have it, of a big group of people. I guess there must have been close to what, dear, 50 or more people who attained 100% Sunday year after year. And Ben Barber had it for something like 15 years, wasn't it?
I think Victor Waite was probably the champion.
Yes, maybe so. I wouldn't doubt. But I know that Dad promised, he says, for every one of you that do 100%, he says, I'll get you a book. The church couldn't, no, that isn't exactly, they promised him a book anyway, for everyone that would attain that goal. And he says, and if the church runs out of funds, I'll see that they get the book. And he did. He gave a lot of donations towards it. I could say one more thing about my dad. A lot of people might have thought he was hard-hearted. But my dad was the most soft-hearted guy that ever lived. Not only to me, but other people. He did a lot to help them. I'll never forget walking along the streets of Ogden one day, and was walking along, a fellow came up to us and he grabbed Dad by the hand. He says, "Damn you, Ole," he says, you taught me how to work. And he did. He taught a lot of people to work, including myself.
It was hard test.
He might have been hard, but he figured that you should earn your money, and he did. I'll never forget one day we sitting out there on the platform waiting for something to happen so we could do our job. And he come along and he said, well, can't you find something to do? And well, we got up and started doing something, started to work, and that taught me that I'd better stay on the ball. A lot of people learned that. He might have got after you and give you the devil, but he was your friend 5 minutes after. He'd never hold a grudge. Well, I've said about all I know about.
Here's something a little besides what we're talking about. You remember Alden Fisher?
You bet.
Probably the first one to fly a plane and maybe land it here.
Mm-hmm.
He was talking to us, and I think your brother Clark and a bunch of other boys hauled that thing in, put it by the factory, and was going to rebuild it. Can you tell us anything about that?
No, I can't. No, I don't. For some reason, I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't around here at that
You
time.
might not have been, because Farrell Gailey can remember it. He's my age.
Do you know what year it was?
It'd be about 34 or 5.
Well, that's it. I was on a mission at that time. I was gone from. See, I went up to Logan to school for 32 and 33, and then I went on a mission 33, 34. And I got back at 35. So that's why I don't remember anything about that. Yeah, I remember Alden. He had a nice new Dodge truck. I'll never forget how, that looked so big to me. And he hauled tomatoes for Dad for some time.
He was a milkman
Yes, he did. That's right.
for quite a few years.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll never forget H.P. Hansen, Clyde Hansen's father, hauling milk. I guess you boys don't remember that, do you?
I can remember the Hansons. But
Well,
I can remember HP, but I can't remember hauling
well,
the
he
milk.
hauled it before Clyde did. When I'd stay out there with Grandma and Grandpa, you'd get up in the morning and you'd hear him whistling up the street there, and pretty soon you'd hear those cans start to rattling, and then he'd come down the road and he's horses and wagon, pick up the milk, take it to Layton.
Here's one we can add to when we get to bus drivers. Let's talk about some things you remember. Who's the first bus driver you can remember?
It was Bodley.
Vernon?
No, it was his dad. What, wasn't it his dad?
Joe?
No. He was
Fred?
Fred Bodley. Now, don't confuse it with these Freds around here or anything. But Fred, at that time, was along in age. He'd be, 55 to 60 years old. When I was a freshman in high school, he drove the school bus. It had seemed to me like it had the lights on the side of the bus some way, or on the front side. But he was a pretty good driver too. He did all right.
What year would that be, approximately?
1928. The
We
fall
have
of
a
28.
picture of the bus, the first bus that went over Davis High in 1925 or 26.
Yeah, it
Quite
could be the
tall.
same bus, yeah.
Is it sort of square?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Probably same
Yeah.
bus. We have that
Yeah.
picture.
And then after him, Arnold Bodley drove it for some time, and then Willard Bambrough. Yeah.
You weren't in the interview. They said that it's Mark Cook on this bus. Would Mark be a little older than you? Wouldn't
Yeah.
he says that he probably took the first bus over to Davis High, and he says between the two viaducts it was sort of,
Oh, it was awful.
and they started swaying that bus,
Tipped it over.
and
Yeah.
it tipped over.
Yeah.
And
Well-
he was there with them.
Was
He
it?
helped.
Well, don't you remember that bridge that went across the DNRG up there?
Yeah.
Well, when you going straight up the road, and then to make it parallel with the track, or perpendicular with it, you had to swing out and then swing in. So you have to go the opposite way, this way, and then in across.
Mm.
And he'd swing that around there, and sometimes I thought that bus would land on the rails. Many a time, I didn't think we'd ever make it. Oh, yeah. We got stuck in the snow up there once or something, and finally got it out. And one of the fellows tried to poke snow up this tailpipe so the motor would go. Oh, it pulled all kinds of...
Somebody flattened the tires, it took them all day to get the
What
tire
pranks
out
did you used to play Halloween?
What pranks?
You didn't do that, I guess.
Oh no, I was perfect. Oh yeah, they used to dump the beets there at the beet dump right there by the factory. Somebody one time dumped the beets right out of the railroad cars, from what I understood. Last Sunday I was down to the sacrament service in Ken Hammond's in the bishopric.
10th Ward.
We sang down there, and Ken told about that. He turned around and he asked me if I remembered it. Well, I remembered it, and I was afraid he... what they're trying to do was blame Ken for dumping those beets, and he didn't do it. And I was afraid he's going to ask me if I did it, but I had nothing to do with it, but I remember it, and I remember a lot of the fellows had dumped the beets out of the wagons that were left there overnight. They just pull the chains and the beets would fall down.
Used to sleigh ride on the corner down there, didn't you?
Yes, but that's not my dad's history, that's mine. I don't know anything about that.
Well, you're old enough, we're gonna bring up to 1970 eventually.
Well, you asked me a question, if I can answer it, I'll do it.
What about, is it true farmers grew watermelons as extra, especially for you guys, so you could steal them?
That's a new one. Well, they grew them. I don't know whether they grew them for us or not, but I guess I got my share of them. I won't.
I didn't know what it was to cut a watermelon, or that there's anything that tasted besides the heart.
Well, Lynn Wilcox and I, when we came home from school, would get down the track there below the factory and sneak out back on the Barnes farm there. Charlie Tora was running it, and get us a watermelon once in a while. Oh, one night after Mutual, so you can tell about how young I was, and we had horses then to ride, us young fellows, and we went down right across from your place there on the old Young place. And there's a Japanese fellow running it, and we sneaked across the road right there about in front of Buck Holbrook's and went up the fence line, and then got across the fence and went back out in there, and we tried to be careful, but we were just thumping some melons, and all of a sudden, bang, zzz, and man, somebody's taking a pot shot at us, and we lifted our ears up, and I couldn't see anybody. Somebody said, we better get out of here, and boy, we did. But I believe it was Frank Kerr, the Japanese fellow, nabbed him. He had him. And after we got down to our horses, we sat there and wondered why he didn't come. And all of a sudden, we heard somebody holler, and he says, hey, come up here, you fellas. And we went up there, and Japanese fella. He says, now you boys, he says, you come in the daytime and I'll give you all the melons you want, but don't come at night. And he gave us a melon or two, and we laughed. Yeah, those were the days. one night after Lola and I were married, we went down, and Lynn Wilcox and Bernice was with us, and we went down on his dad's place and stole a couple of melons. We snipped in.
We stole them off Lynn's dad's patch. Lynn was with us.
Chicory, have you heard about those chicories?
Oh, yeah. You bet. Do you want me to tell you a story about
Yeah.
getting a chicken?
Yeah.
Well, one Sunday afternoon, Lynn and I were about probably 15, 16 years old. We walked down the track below the factory there, and we got down to Delbert Wilcox's, and nobody was around. There was just a few chickens out there in the yard, and we picked up a rock, and one of us smacked an old rooster in the head, and picked him up and took him up home and dressed him out, and went out there in the cottages where the girls used to stay that peel the tomatoes. And we fired up a good fire and put it in a frying pan. We fried and cooked and fried and cooked, and man, that thing, it was so tough you couldn't even start your teeth. Finally we threw it out the dog, and he just sniffed it and walked off. But years later I told Delbert about it. I said, Delbert, I want to pay you for that rooster that we killed. No, Delbert, he says, well, boys, he says, I've done those things too. He wouldn't take a dime.
Here's an area maybe we need to touch on. Then Don's got an appointment at 3:30. Since you were on the Barnes property, and John R. Barnes run it through the Japanese, tell us a little bit what you can remember how that was set up, and maybe when did the Japanese first come in and things like that.
Well, about all I can remember about that, see, I was just a boy when we came here. I was about 9 or 10 years old. But I do remember several Japanese families moving in here, and Dad would help them get settled. And various ones, and I can't remember just who came when and so forth, but I know that there was Baba. Remember him?
Yeah, tell us something
You
about
remember
him.
Baba? He lived right across from the schoolhouse.
He was
there.
a single, wasn't he?
Yes, I don't think he ever married. Yes, he did too. Yes, he did. I can tell you a story, but it wouldn't be fit to tell here about him wanting. He wanted children, and they didn't have children. But and then there was Odas and Saharas. Now Saharas lived right across the corner, on the corner from Bessie Gailey's, right across the street there. I don't know who lives there now. They lived there for years.
There's a Mexican family there.
Well, but there's little Harry. He was a little Japanese fellow. There was George and one other boy. They were good farmers too, but they were very, very good farmers, very industrious. They only had one big problem, that is how to handle horses. Oh, they had a terrible time. There was a Japanese fellow that was just below the factory there. Oh, I wished I could remember his name. He's a little fellow. He had two big horses. One of them was about 1,800 pounds, and the other over 2,000. Over 2,000. And how he ever got a harness on those horses, I'll never know. But every time he'd come up to the factory with a load of tomatoes, he'd tear up everything in the place. He couldn't control those horses. I don't know whether he didn't have the strength, or he just didn't know how to do it. And they were big horses, and they'd tear up his equipment and everything else.
Your dad managed the Japanese farmers, didn't he?
Well, he kind of helped them. He helped them a lot. One thing about those Japanese people, they were very grateful to Father and Mother too, and every Christmas they'd bring us gifts that you can't believe. Usually tea sets, Japanese tea sets, and dinnerware, things of that nature.
We've got Tom Yamada working with us on the committee to help us with the history of the Japanese. And George told me that he's got some pictures and stuff. He's probably gonna bring Thursday.
I'm George's.
Yeah.
Do you have any pictures of the factory?
You brought down a couple of
Yeah, and
pictures
you
of the
got
factory.
those, all right. You know, there's one thing we never did do, and that was to get a good picture of that old house. I have one just of the front porch, and Dad and Mother sitting there, but that's about all I have on it.
Do you have any pictures related to Charles Barber or any of the early,
Yeah.
can we get a copy of those?
You bet.
We got a place in Layton, we don't need, what am I thinking of?
Negative.
Negative.
Reproduction.
We can just take it over and it just comes out that good.
Any size picture.
Any size picture.
They'll blow them up or cut them down or?
There's a picture right there of Grandma and Grandma's old home, and I've got a better one of that right here too. Here's a picture of Granddad right there, just a small one. And that's a pretty good one.
Yeah, they'll make them larger or smaller.
Oh, here it is. Now there's a darn good picture of Granddad and Grandmother's home. Do you recognize it?
Well, yeah, I've got a video on it and talked about it.
Okay.
It's still down there.
Yeah, that's the,
Needs a little work on though.
whoops.
It needs a little attention, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's got a picket fence in it. Yeah.
One day I just went around to old homes that's built about, the turn of the century, maybe up to 1910. Like T.J. Thurgood's
No, I just thought about
one Joe's in, and George Bennett's old home there that Cleo's in.
No.
And we've taken pictures of old reservoirs and things like this.
Did you get a picture of the old factory house then?
We,
I think we did at the factory house, did we?
no,
Just
it's
that
just been recently that we've been
Probably it
doing
was
this.
torn down and got rid of.
Yeah, that's different than the ones.
Well, we might as well turn that off, Dawn, and I'll help you pack up.
I can't think of anything else.
Whoops.
We'd appreciate getting a copy of that.
I'll do that.
Pictures.
We'll, time I'll take them up and we can get a coffee while you're